attacks across Brazil against black people, journalists, homosexuals.
Utterly toxic presidential content.
Jair Bolsonaro, do PSL, tem 59% dos votos válidos.
Once again, we're seeing social media being used as a political weapon.
Imprensa livre, parabéns!
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories we're covering this week. Jair Bolsonaro looks like a shoo-in for the presidency in Brazil, with a little help from WhatsApp and his friends in the media. Threatening behavior, and the Moscow newspaper that's learned to take threats against its journalists seriously. The politician the British papers love to beat up on. He has plans for the UK media. And
for me, the story personally starts with 9/11.
Friedman exposed. The reputation of one of Saudi Arabia's defenders in the American media is amongst the casualties of the Jamal Khashoggi story. We're going back to Brazil this week, where the second and final round of presidential elections takes place Sunday the 28th. A Jair Bolsonaro victory seems all but sealed. Bolsonaro is a former paratrooper with an agenda straight out of the far right, a penchant for rhetoric that's misogynistic, racist, and threatening, and a campaign that's been powered by social media, most notably on WhatsApp. When confronted by reports that corporations have been spending big, spreading misinformation on social media to help get him into office, Bolsonaro called the newspaper that broke that story, Folha de São Paulo, fake news. Sound familiar? Among the networks in Bolsonaro's corner is Record TV. It's owned by a billionaire bishop, Edir Macedo, who heads one of Brazil's biggest evangelical churches. Journalists at Record have been ordered to keep their coverage of Bolsonaro positive and to report on his leftist opponent, Fernando Haddad, either neutrally or negatively. Our starting point this week is the world's fifth most populous country, Brazil. In Brazil, it's never been easier to get information. It's never been harder to sort fact from fiction and fake news. Fact checkers there are working overtime.
It's been brutal. The volume is huge. We have 24 media outlets reproducing our fact-checking work. TV channels, radio stations, newspapers and websites. We've managed to draw attention to the problem, but we're under no illusions that we can stop it and make the truth overcome all the lies that are being told.
Much of the misinformation is happening on WhatsApp, which is the preeminent messaging platform in Brazil. More than half the population uses the service. WhatsApp is a political force there like nowhere else. Jair Bolsonaro entered the campaign as an outsider from a small party, knowing he could not count on coverage or advertising time on mainstream media outlets. He and his supporters went all in on social media, and it's paid off. According to an investigation published in Brazil's most widely read newspaper, Folha de São Paulo, Bolsonaro's WhatsApp offensive has been secretly boosted by several unnamed corporations. Those companies paid digital marketing firms, experts at some of the dark arts of the web, a total of $3.2 million to push pro-Bolsonaro messaging, attacking his opponent Fernando Haddad with stories, many of which were made up. Under Brazilian electoral law, such undisclosed corporate donations to a political campaign are illegal. Bolsonaro called Folha de São Paulo's investigation fake news.
A Folha de São Paulo é o maior fake news do Brasil.
A gente fez uma apuração.
We ran a full fact check on this story with sources who deal directly with the agencies responsible for sending these messages. We concluded that there has been undeclared support from businesses for a presidential candidate, and that is against electoral law in Brazil. This has been subverting the campaign. Bolsonaro has denied all accusations. After all, if he admitted any wrongdoing, he would be admitting to an electoral crime.
Assumindo crime eleitoral.
Se ele conhecia ou desconhecia.
We cannot know for sure whether Bolsonaro was aware about businessmen taking such action in his favor. The fact is, he has a tendency to repeat fake stories, untruths that do the rounds on social media. For instance, in many interviews, he mentions a book. that supposedly promoted homosexuality in Brazilian schools during Fernando Haddad's time as education minister. In reality, this book had never been included in any school syllabus.
Usually, Jair Bolsonaro does not share fake material. He leaves the bulk of that to others. But he did share this image on Twitter, purportedly showing a death threat against him. When it emerged that the picture was actually 2 years old, had nothing to do with politics, and had been photoshopped, Bolsonaro deleted it. The formerly fringe politician finds himself well ahead in the polls, despite rhetoric that once would have kept him out of the mainstream.
Será uma limpeza nunca visto na história do Brasil. Vamos fuzilar a petralhada aqui do Acre. Pela memória do coronel.
And in 2016, when he voted to impeach former leftist President Dilma Rousseff, he dedicated his vote to an intelligence officer who ran torture programs in the 1970s. Among those tortured, Miss Rousseff herself. In a campaign rife with misinformation, social media companies have been slow to react. Over the past 3 months, Facebook has taken down hundreds of accounts and pages, what it called a coordinated network built for sowing division and spreading misinformation. Measures that appear to be too little, and in the case of this election, too late.
Social media platforms keep saying they're neutral, but this is false because their algorithms decide what content each person receives. That makes them editors, but they have never taken their responsibilities as editors seriously. They announce partnerships with fact-checking agencies and newspapers to look like they're doing something, but it is completely ineffective. The issue is the business of social media. These platforms are fueled by hatred and anger, negative feelings that motivate people to engage in conversations and spend more time on the apps.
It is a fact that Brazilians trust people who are close to them more than institutions like the media or the judiciary, for example. This campaign has taken place mainly on social media, primarily on WhatsApp. People receive information from those who are close to them and believe these people.
And then there's the issue of polarization. Fake news appeals to people's emotions. So if the content you receive is reinforcing your existing beliefs, if it makes you feel confident that you are right, you are more inclined to believe it than something that contests or challenges your beliefs.
Having ascended to the front-runner position via social media, Jair Bolsonaro has since found backers on the mainstream side. Record TV is Brazil's second biggest network. It's owned by Jair Macedo, who also heads a major evangelical church. Record has not officially endorsed Bolsonaro on the air. It didn't really have to. Macedo posted his endorsement of the candidate on Facebook. Ever since then, Macedo's news outlets have given Bolsonaro a surplus of airtime, minus the tough questions they ask his opponents.
Os seus eleitores depositam no senhor uma confiança e uma garantia no combate à corrupção e também à criminalidade.
The clear bias in coverage has prompted journalists under Macedo's employ to leak stories of shameless favoritism to other news outlets, like the online site The Intercept.
Record TV has always had direct interference from its owners, but now the newsroom is really being forced to go against established journalistic principles. This morning on a radio station that belongs to them, they interviewed Bolsonaro, but only one journalist could ask questions. The others had to stay quiet.
Nós podemos dizer que o candidato nos censurou?
At the end, one of the journalists got up and said,
Foi prazer trabalhar aqui 10 anos.
Also, I've written an article about journalists from Record's R7 website who have told me that they're no longer publishing their names against any political reports. The articles are all bylines simply R7. This is an absolutely clear sign that no one at Record wants to get their name dirty in this mud machine.
Bishop Jair
Macedo has a long history as a public figure and has shown the ability to get close to most political parties. He's a pragmatist, if nothing else. Once upon a time, he was close to the Workers' Party. This time around, he has found an ideological alliance with Bolsonaro. We can see a clear proximity, not around economic or political ideas, but in matters of culture. And Jair Bolsonaro will likely benefit from that partnership.
Media owners usually do when their chosen candidate takes power, although Jair Bolsonaro, having run most of his campaign online, may feel less indebted than most. One more thing the Brazilian media might consider as the former military man prepares for the presidency. That torture chief Bolsonaro chose to honor that day in Brasilia, he didn't just have political activists as his victims, he also ordered and oversaw the torture of news reporters. Jair Bolsonaro does not mince his words, but Brazilian journalists will want to watch theirs. We're discussing other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Johanna Hus. Joe, a Moscow paper known for pushing the journalistic boundaries in Russia says that one of its reporters has been threatened. What's the story at Novaya Gazeta?
Well, last week, a funeral wreath was sent to the newspaper's office, followed the next day by a basket with a severed goat's head in it. Attached were a couple of notes, one of which read, "To Novaya Gazeta's chief editor, greetings to you and Korotkov." Another note said, "Traitor to his country." Now, the journalist being referred to in that note was Denis Korotkov.
What kind of work has Korotkov been doing?
Well, he recently wrote an article on Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian businessman indicted in Washington for allegedly interfering in the 2016 presidential election. Now, he reported that Prigozhin, whose ties to President Putin go way back, orchestrated the killing of an opposition blogger. Korotkov based that story on interviews he says he did with one of Prigozhin's former security aides, who has since disappeared. Now, it's not surprising the newspaper takes threats against its journalists as real. Over the last 18 years, 5 of its reporters have been murdered.
Okay, moving on now to the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Last week, we looked at how some prominent news voices in the Western media have been called out for their pro-Saudi writing. Some news outlets starting to change their tune a little, but the kingdom still has plenty of supporters on the airwaves. Who and where are they?
Well, Richard, for years, pundits in the Anglo-American media have talked up Saudi Arabia as a bastion of stability in the Middle East, which is debatable to say the least. But following Khashoggi's killing, most news outlets in the West have been more critical of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in particular and the US-Saudi relationship in general. Now, the same cannot be said of Fox News. 2 weeks after Khashoggi's first went missing, a Fox News anchor said this.
This was a real disappointment because this was our last hope of any stability in the Middle East to fight back on the terrorists from Iran. Do you walk away from that when you know that this was our, we needed that partnership with the Saudis to fight the terrorists in Iran?
Still, not entirely unsurprising, given that we're talking about Fox News. But what about Saudi Arabia's allies in the Gulf? Are they any better, or have they been any better at scrutinizing their powerful neighbor, post-Khashoggi?
Not at all. Tuning into coverage in Gulf countries such as Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, journalists seem anything but willing to criticize the kingdom. This is what some of them had to say.
وأعرب سموه عن تقديره العميق للمكانة الرفيعة التي تتمتع بها المملكة وقيادتها، مثمنا موقعها كقوة رئيسية لضمان أمن واستقرار العالمين العربي والإسلامي والمنطقة برمتها.
كما أكد مجلس الشورى أن المملكة العربية السعودية الشقيقة تعد الركيزة الأساسية وقطب الاستقرار والأمن في العالمين العربي والإسلامي.
أكد وزير دولة الإمارات للشؤون الخارجية أنور قرقاش أن الحضور والدور السعودي يمثل أساسا للاستقرار والتنمية في محيط صعب ومضطرب من وجهة نظر أبناء الخليج والمنطقة.
And what did those 3 reports have in common? Well, they all use the S word, stability, which seems to matter more to those channels and the governments that own them than the life of a journalist.
Okay, thanks, Joe. In more than a decade of producing The Listening Post, we have often examined the ways in which the news media have grown into essential components of political debates. Take the UK, for example, where Jeremy Corbyn leads the biggest political party in terms of membership in Western Europe. His supporters say the corporate media, primarily in the print sector, are out to smear him, plain and simple, since his left-wing policies are a threat to the establishment that they represent. It's a contention his critics reject outright. Amidst all the mudslinging, Corbyn has willingly waded into the fray with some proposals that, should he ever come to power, would change the rules of the media game in Britain. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on the debate around Jeremy Corbyn, his ideas for altering publicly owned broadcasting, siphoning money from some tech giants and directing it to the BBC, and curbing the power of media conglomerates.
They shouted coward at you this afternoon.
But why do you think you and Trump have no appeal to the young?
Well, I don't think, I disagree with that. And why? The evidence is...
British politicians are rarely given an easy ride by the media, and that's for good reason. But for Jeremy Corbyn, the ride has been particularly rough.
So your future as Labour leader is absolutely intact. You've not considered for a moment whether you as leader are damaging the party's
I'm really
chance.
surprised the BBC is reporting fake news.
In 2015, Corbyn was elected leader of Britain's opposition party, the Labour Party. And in the 3 years since, much of the British news coverage has often ridiculed, caricatured and demonised him and his policies.
Here's the thing about the media representations or misrepresentations of Jeremy Corbyn, is that they're not particularly consistent. So 1 minute he's a dangerous terrorist sympathiser. On the other hand, he's portrayed as ineffectual, as a pacifist, a vegetarian leaf eater, a bit of a herbivore.
Whether a result of negative coverage or not, Corbyn has long held ideas about the media, how to rethink it, how to restructure it.
Our media, in many cases, is failing. Now, this isn't just the view of someone who's had, shall we say, an interesting relationship with the media, particularly over the last 3 years.
A few months back, Corbyn was invited to speak at one of the British media's key industry events, the Edinburgh Television Festival. And he used that platform to launch his vision for the future of journalism. On the national public broadcaster, the BBC, Corbyn had a few ideas on how it's funded and how it should be governed. Currently, the broadcaster's board members are appointed in part by the government and the rest selected by BBC senior management. Corbyn wants to make this more democratic. He said that the public, whose taxes pay for the broadcaster, as well as BBC employees, should be the ones who choose the board.
He has this view that to depoliticise the BBC, it would be a good idea to have some form of elected officials at the top of the organisation. It's one of those things that seems like a very nice idea in theory, but if you create a system whereby some sort of non-executive board are elected, the next step to having elections is to turn them into sort of a plaything for political parties. So far from depoliticising the BBC, it seems to me that actually holding elections to determine who has a say in how it operates is the very thing that would make it highly politicised.
And when it comes to diversity, Corbyn called for full transparency about who works at the broadcaster, not just in terms of ethnicity, but in terms of class too.
So here's the thing about England. Only 7% of UK school children go to private schools, and yet if you have this private school background, you are more likely to get top jobs in the media. Look at the Grenfell tragedy that happened in 2017. Residents of Grenfell have been trying to reach out to media saying, look, we are being left in unsafe accommodation and we're worried that it's going to take a tragedy, a fatal tragedy, to get people to listen. These are the people who are shut out of newsrooms, and they're also the same people who might be plugged into stories, into communities that more privileged people just can't reach. That's a grave failing of the media establishment.
Corbyn's rise to prominence comes as a surprise to many, but his appeal, a left-leaning socialist politics of yestercentury, resonates when it comes to current debates on the rise of unregulated tech giants.
The public realm doesn't have to sit back and watch as a few megatech corporations hoovered up digital rights, assets, and ultimately our money.
The UK media, its broadcasters and its newspapers, are suffering as big tech sucks the life and money out of them. So, like many others, Corbyn is calling for them to be reined in, taxed more. But he's gone further. He says the proceeds from that tax should fund public broadcasting, as well as cash-strapped investigative journalism and local media.
The suggestion that tech giants and so-called platform monopolies should make a financial contribution to subsidise news in the public interest is actually not at all radical. There's been a long-standing precedent in media policy making that there are some aspects of the media that are not profitable, that are not even necessarily commercially viable, but are absolutely essential to the public interest and to reinforcing democracy.
The British media is dominated by a handful of powerful conglomerates. Just 3 companies control 71% of the national newspaper market. Top of that list is Rupert Murdoch's News UK, housed in the building right behind me. News UK owns The Sun, Britain's biggest selling paper, as well as The Sun on Sunday, The Times and The Sunday Times. It also used to own the News of the World, but that paper was shut down after revelations that journalists there had been hacking the phone of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler. That scandal led to a 2-part Leveson inquiry. The first part called for a state-backed press regulator that all newspapers would have to sign up to or face the consequences. The Conservative government rejected it. The second part would have got at the relationship between newspapers and the police. In March of this year, the government abandoned it. Corbyn wants to recall Leveson, to hold the media to account for past crimes, and to push for future regulation.
I think media ownership in particular is strong ground for Corbyn and for Labour. It taps into the sort of the broader attack that Corbyn has been making on capitalism. But I think it also plays to the notion that there has been a closeness between the Conservative Party in particular and the media barons, which for Jeremy Corbyn is something very much to push against, given that he sees himself as very much the man of the people.
Jeremy Corbyn, are you an anti-Semite? No.
That pushback has become an increasingly Sisyphean task for Corbyn. His speech came at the height of a story that had been hitting the headlines week in, week out. Accusations of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, often targeting the leader himself.
Mr. Corbyn, what are you going to do about the perceived anti-Semitism in your party? Mr. Corbyn, have you got any comment?
This month, a study produced by the Media Reform Coalition took a close look at some 250 articles and broadcast news clips covering the anti-Semitism story. More than 90 of them were found to be either misleading or inaccurate.
What we have seen across the national press, and largely echoed in broadcasters, is something that I think is truly unprecedented. And that's not so much in the kind of critical stance that they have taken towards Corbyn and the policy platforms that he represents, but just in what we know from research that we've produced. There's been a systematic subversion of basic journalistic news values.
When Jeremy Corbyn ran to become Labour's leader, he triggered the biggest party membership surge in British history. Media across the country hadn't seen him coming. They discounted him, dismissed him.
Jeremy Corbyn.
And 3 years in, the media are still grappling with how to deal with him and the revival of the socialist politics that he has inspired. A politics which for Corbyn must involve a radical overhaul, a structural reform of the media itself.
Back to Saudi Arabia and the Khashoggi story. The coverage of Saudi issues in the U.S. news media, the kid gloves with which the kingdom has been treated for so long, seems to have shifted. The reportedly premeditated murder of a journalist lured to a consulate under false pretenses has had that effect. However, some of the voices that constantly defended Saudi Arabia and were in the thrall of the new crown prince's alleged reforms are still out there. Notorious case in point, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. He was interviewed on CNN this past week where he defended his previous columns. Out came the amateur media critics in the comments section, and they dismantled Friedman's lamentable track record of getting it wrong on the Middle East better than we ever could. We'll leave it to them, and we'll see you next time here at the Listening Post.
Was everybody, were you too quick to call him and brand him a reformer? So take us through what was going through your mind and what you saw in him then compared to today.
Great. So let me start for the beginning for me, Christian. It's one of the reasons I wanted to be on your show, is I actually would have some time to talk. And for me, the story personally starts with 9/11. Now, some people said, you know what, Tom, it's all a fake because look what he's doing in Yemen, look what he's, people that he's arresting here. And my attitude was, maybe there's clearly a downside here, there's clearly an upside, and I thought it was worth investing a little hope in the upside if we could curb the downside.